What if I told you that a billionaire's mistress laughed while streaming live as his pregnant wife packed her bags? But that wife was sitting on family secrets worth more than his entire empire. This is the true story of Sarah Montgomery, a woman who lost everything in 30 seconds of cruel laughter, only to discover that her grandmother had been preparing weapons for this exact war for over 40 years. What happened next destroyed a social media empire, exposed a criminal dynasty, and proved that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who has nothing left to lose. This is a story of betrayal, revenge, and the long game of justice. And trust me, you won't see the ending coming. If this story of ultimate justice gave you chills, smash that like button and let me know in the comments what you would have done in Sarah's situation. Share this with someone who needs to hear that truth really does have its own power. And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this, where the underdog wins against impossible odds, are exactly what this channel is all about. Hit that notification bell, because next week I'm bringing you another tale of sweet revenge that will restore your faith in karma. Sarah Montgomery stood frozen in the marble foyer of her Malibu mansion, her 7-month pregnant belly pressed against the cold doorframe as she watched her husband's mistress laugh on Instagram Live. The sound echoed through their empty home like broken glass. "Oh my God, you guys!" Amber Sterling giggled into her phone, her perfectly contoured face glowing on the screen. "Blake's wife is literally packing her bags right now. Can you believe it? Yesterday's news finally taking out the trash herself." Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped her grandmother's leather journal, the only thing she'd grabbed besides clothes. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see Blake Wellington lounging by their infinity pool with Amber, both of them treating her heartbreak like entertainment for 10 million followers. The comments flooded in faster than Sarah could read them. Crying, laughing emojis, fire symbols, hundreds of strangers celebrating the destruction of her marriage like it was a reality show finale. "Blake says she's been so dramatic lately," Amber continued, examining her diamond-encrusted nails. "Like, pregnancy isn't an excuse to be psycho. Right. Some women just can't handle when their man upgrades." Sarah had given up everything for Blake: her promising Nashville songwriting career, her independence, even the rights to songs that had once been her babies. She'd believed his promises about building a life together, about her music mattering to him. Now she understood the truth. She'd been the opening act, and Amber Sterling was the headliner he'd been waiting for. Her phone buzzed with a text from Blake. "Left papers on kitchen counter. Sign them. This doesn't have to get ugly." The divorce papers were already printed, already notarized. He'd planned this humiliation down to the minute. Sarah's signature line waited next to clauses that would leave her with nothing. No alimony, no assets, no rights to the social media empire she'd helped him build with her creative ideas and emotional labor. But it was the custody arrangement that made her sink onto the marble steps. Blake wanted full rights to their unborn daughter, the baby girl Sarah had fought to conceive through 3 miscarriages and endless medical procedures. The child doctors said would be her only chance at motherhood due to her condition. Outside, Amber's laughter grew louder as she filmed Blake doing cannonballs into their pool. Their pool, the one Sarah had designed, choosing every tile by hand while dreaming of teaching their children to swim. "You know what's funny?" Amber said to her phone camera. She actually thought she was irreplaceable. "Like, girl, you gave up your music career for a man. That's not romantic. That's just stupid." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She'd believed in Blake's vision, trusted his promise that her sacrifice would matter. Instead, she'd become a cautionary tale, broadcast live to millions of strangers who saw her pain as entertainment. Sarah closed her eyes and pressed her palm against her belly, feeling her daughter kick. Emma. They'd chosen the name together, back when Blake still pretended to care about their future. Back when he'd held her hand during ultrasounds and talked about teaching their little girl to code. "I'm going to protect you," Sarah whispered to her unborn daughter. "Whatever it takes." She stood slowly, her back aching from the baby's weight, and walked toward the door. Behind her, Amber's voice drifted through the windows. "Blake says she'll probably try to write some pathetic tell-all book, as if anyone would care about her boring little life story." Sarah paused at the threshold of the home she'd loved, the life she'd built, the future she'd lost. In her grandmother's journal, pressed between yellowed pages, Lay secrets Blake didn't know existed. Stories about his father, evidence that could change everything. But not today. Today, she had to survive. Today, she had to find somewhere safe to have her baby. "See you in court, Blake," Sarah said to the empty house, then stepped into the California sunshine, carrying nothing but her grandmother's secrets and a promise to the daughter still growing inside her. The last thing she heard before closing the door was Amber's voice, still streaming live, "And that's how you upgrade your life. Ladies, sometimes the trash takes itself out." Maya Rodriguez found Sarah 3 days later in a downtown Los Angeles motel, subsisting on vending machine crackers and refusing to answer her phone. As an investigative journalist, Maya had exposed corrupt politicians and corporate criminals. But she'd never seen anyone look as defeated as her best friend did, sitting on that threadbare bedspread. "He froze everything," Sarah said without looking up from the legal papers scattered around her. "Bank accounts, credit cards, even the joint savings account I use for my music equipment. His lawyers are claiming I'm mentally unstable due to pregnancy hormones." Maya sat beside her, carefully moving aside the divorce documents. "What about your family? Your mother?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Diane Cooper doesn't return calls from failures. Haven't you seen the headlines? Her Broadway connections are already gossiping about how Blake Wellington's crazy ex-wife finally showed her true colors." The legal strategy was brutally efficient. Blake's team had painted Sarah as an unstable gold digger who trapped him with pregnancy, then had a psychological breakdown when he found real love. They'd leaked selective text messages where Sarah expressed frustration about their relationship, framing her legitimate concerns as evidence of mental illness. "Look at this," Sarah handed Maya her phone, where Amber's latest Instagram post showed her in Blake's private jet, hands strategically placed over her still flat stomach. The caption read, "Baby Wellington coming soon. Blake is such an amazing father already. Some women just aren't built for this life." "She's pregnant too," Maya asked. "Supposedly, convenient timing, right?" Sarah's voice was hollow. "The comments are calling me a bitter ex trying to trap Blake with a fake pregnancy. They're saying I should have stepped aside gracefully when he found his soulmate." Shukran, Maya scrolled through the vicious comments, seeing how Blake's social media empire was being weaponized against Sarah. Bots and influencers amplified hashtags like "He's show crazy pregnant ex" and "Gold digger defeated." The narrative was airtight. Blake was the victim. Amber was the innocent new love, and Sarah was the unhinged woman who couldn't accept reality. "They're destroying your reputation before you can even tell your side," Maya said. "This isn't just a divorce. It's character assassination." Sarah's phone rang. "Dr. Martinez from her OB/GYN practice." "Mrs. Wellington, I'm calling about your insurance. There seems to be an issue with coverage for your high-risk pregnancy monitoring." After Sarah hung up, Maya saw the full scope of Blake's strategy. Without insurance, the weekly monitoring Sarah needed for her complicated pregnancy would cost thousands. The stress was already taking its toll. Dark circles shadowed Sarah's eyes, and her hands shook when she tried to eat. "He's not just taking your money," Maya realized. "He's sabotaging your health. If something happens to the baby, he gets what he wants either way," Sarah finished. "If I lose Emma, he's free to start over with Amber. If I keep her, he'll use my financial desperation to take custody." That night, Maya stayed in the motel room as Sarah suffered her first stress-induced contractions. They spent 4 hours in the emergency room, where doctors warned that continued anxiety could trigger premature labor. The medical bills were already mounting, and Sarah was only 7 months along. "We need to fight back," Maya said as they returned to the motel at dawn. "I can investigate Blake's business practices." "There has to be something?" Sarah shook her head. "You don't understand his power. Blake controls 3 major social media platforms. He can destroy your career with one algorithm change. He's got senators in his pocket and judges who owe him favors." But Maya was already thinking like a reporter. "What about your grandmother's journal? You mentioned it contains family history." For the first time in days, something flickered in Sarah's eyes. "My grandmother worked for Blake's father back in the 1980s. She kept detailed records of everything she witnessed." "What kind of records?" Sarah opened the worn leather journal, revealing pages of meticulous handwriting interspersed with newspaper clippings and photocopied documents. "Evidence of how the Wellington family really built their fortune?" My grandmother was their bookkeeper. She documented everything they wanted hidden. Maya examined the documents, her journalistic instincts sharpening. Sarah, some of this could be criminal, tax evasion, money laundering, possibly worse. I know, Sarah said quietly, but Blake has armies of lawyers. Even if this evidence is legitimate, I'm just a pregnant woman in a motel room. Who's going to believe me against him? On cue, Sarah's phone buzzed with notifications. Someone had leaked her location to Blake's followers. Outside their window, cars were already pulling into the motel parking lot, people with cameras ready to film the next chapter of her humiliation. We need to move, Maya said, gathering Sarah's few belongings. But first, we're making copies of everything in that journal. As they fled through the motel's back exit, Sarah wondered if she was fighting a war she'd already lost. Blake had everything: money, power, public sympathy, and a media empire designed to destroy his enemies. All she had was her grandmother's secrets and a daughter she might not live to protect. The contractions started during Blake's wedding to Amber, broadcast live across his social media platforms like a royal ceremony for the digital age. Sarah doubled over in her new studio apartment, water breaking as 10 million viewers watched her replacement exchange vows with the man who'd once promised her forever. Maya rushed Sarah to Cedars-Sinai, where the emergency room staff recognized her immediately. Not as Blake Wellington's ex-wife, but as the woman the internet had branded a stalker. The hashtag #JustYourCrazyPregnantEx had evolved into #Stalker Sarah after Blake's legal team leaked a restraining order request claiming Sarah was harassing him. Please, Sarah gasped between contractions. My baby's only 32 weeks. She needs help. The attending physician, Dr. Kim, examined Sarah with professional detachment. We'll do everything possible, but premature births carry significant risks. Do you have insurance? Denied, Maya said, showing the paperwork. Her ex-husband's lawyers are claiming she committed insurance fraud by not disclosing mental health issues. Sarah's daughter Emma was born weighing 3 pounds, her tiny lungs struggling to function independently. As the NICU team worked to stabilize her, Sarah watched through a window, connected to monitors herself after complications during delivery. She's beautiful, Maya whispered, squeezing Sarah's hand. Emma looked impossibly fragile under the warming lights, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed with artificial life. Tubes helped her breathe while wires monitored every heartbeat. The NICU doctor explained she'd need weeks of intensive care, possibly months. The estimated cost is between $200,000 and $500,000, the financial counselor informed them. Without insurance, we'll need a payment plan or what? Sarah asked, though she already knew. We can transfer her to a county facility once she's stabilized. The care there is adequate, but Sarah understood. County hospitals meant overwhelmed staff, outdated equipment, and babies who sometimes didn't make it home. Emma deserved better. Emma deserved everything Sarah couldn't provide. Her phone buzzed with a text from Blake. Heard about the baby. Sorry for your loss. Emma wasn't dead. She was fighting for life 20 feet away. But Blake had already written her off, perhaps hoping Sarah's grief would make the custody battle irrelevant. The social media response was equally heartless. Blake's followers celebrated Emma's premature birth as karma for Sarah's supposed harassment. Amber posted a photo of her own ultrasound with the caption, praying for all babies to be born healthy to loving, stable families. The subtext was clear. Sarah was neither loving nor stable, and Emma's struggle was consequence of her mother's failures. I need to see her, Sarah said, struggling to sit up despite her stitches. The NICU had strict protocols. Only immediate family members during designated hours. Sarah's name was on the approved list, but Blake's legal team had already filed paperwork questioning her parental rights. Security guards now monitored her visits, documenting everything for potential court proceedings. Emma's incubator was labeled Baby Girl Wellington, not Baby Girl Montgomery, as Sarah had requested. Even here, Blake's influence shaped reality. Their daughter belonged to his world, not hers. Talk to her, the NICU nurse encouraged. Premature babies respond to their mother's voice. Sarah placed her hand against the incubator's plastic wall, as close to touching Emma as the barriers allowed. I'm here. Baby girl. Mommy's here, and I'm not going anywhere. But even as she spoke the words, Sarah wondered if they were true. The hospital bills were mounting daily. Her savings were gone. Maya had started a crowdfunding campaign, but Blake's followers bombarded it with negative comments and fake donation reversals. Dr. Kim returned with updates. Emma's responding well to treatment, but she'll need specialized care for several more weeks. There's also the possibility of long-term complications that would require ongoing therapy. More costs, more battles, more reasons for Blake to argue that Sarah couldn't provide adequate care for their daughter. That evening, Maya brought news from her investigation. I found something in your grandmother's journal, a company called Meridian Holdings that Blake's father used to launder money in the 1980s. Blake still has ties to it. Does it matter? Sarah asked, exhausted from the day's emotional toll. Even if we prove Blake's family committed crimes, what does that change about Emma? Everything, Maya said firmly. If Blake's wealth comes from criminal activity, the courts might reconsider custody arrangements. Plus, I think your grandmother left more than just records. Some of these documents reference safe deposit boxes and hidden accounts. Sarah studied her grandmother's handwriting, seeing patterns she'd missed before. References to insurance policies and protection measures scattered throughout decades of entries. Her meticulous grandmother had been building something, preparing for a war that might only be fought by future generations. She knew, Sarah realized. Grandmother knew the Wellington family would eventually come after our family. She was gathering weapons. As if responding to her mother's determination, Emma's vital signs strengthened on the monitors. Her oxygen levels improved, and her heart rate steadied into a more regular rhythm. She's a fighter, the night nurse observed. Just like her mother. Sarah spent that night beside Emma's incubator, reading her grandmother's journal aloud like bedtime stories. Tales of corruption and courage, of a bookkeeper who documented everything while pretending to see nothing. By morning, Sarah had a plan. Blake thought he'd won by isolating her, bankrupting her, and turning public opinion against her. But he'd underestimated the power of a mother's love and a grandmother's foresight. The war was just beginning. Sarah's mother, Diane Cooper, arrived at the hospital wearing Chanel and carrying flowers that probably cost more than Sarah's weekly motel budget. She swept into the NICU like she was making a grand entrance at one of her Broadway productions, all dramatic gestures and calculated emotion. My poor darling, Diane said, embracing Sarah with the kind of hug that looked loving but felt hollow. When I heard about little Emma, I dropped everything and flew straight from New York. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to hope. Her relationship with Diane had been complicated since childhood, full of missed recitals and broken promises, but perhaps becoming a grandmother would change things. Perhaps family tragedy could heal old wounds. She's so tiny, Diane whispered, peering at Emma through the incubator's plastic barriers. But strong. She has the Cooper determination. We're survivors, darling. We always find a way. Diane wrote a check for $50,000 toward Emma's medical bills, then hired her own legal team to challenge Blake's custody claims. For 2 weeks, Sarah felt like she had an ally who understood power and how to wield it. Maya remained suspicious. Your mother disappeared for most of your adult life. Why show up now? Maybe she realizes what matters, Sarah said, watching Diane charm the NICU nurses and speak authoritatively with doctors. Maybe seeing Emma made her remember that family comes first. The first crack appeared when Sarah overheard a phone conversation. Diane was in the hospital cafeteria, speaking quietly but not quietly enough. Yes, I understand the timeline, Diane was saying. Sarah trusts me completely now. I'll have access to everything within the week. Sarah ducked behind a vending machine, her heart racing as she strained to hear more. The journal contains exactly what you suspected, Diane continued. But there's more. Sarah mentioned safe deposit boxes and hidden accounts. My mother was more thorough than anyone realized. A pause. Then Diane's voice, cold and businesslike. Blake, darling, you're paying me to deliver my daughter and granddaughter to you. That's exactly what I intend to do. Sarah's world collapsed for the second time in a month. Her own mother was working for Blake, feeding him information about Sarah's plans and her grandmother's evidence. The woman who just paid Emma's medical bills was also orchestrating their destruction. She stumbled back to the NICU, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. Diane had been absent during Sarah's childhood because she'd been building her theater empire. Now she was risking Emma's future to protect those same business interests. "Sweetheart, you look pale," Diane said when Sarah returned. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired," Sarah managed, studying her mother's face for signs of the deception she now knew existed. "All of this has been overwhelming." "Of course it has. But you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. I'm here to help you make the right decisions." The right decisions? Sarah understood now that Diane's version of right meant whatever Blake was paying her to arrange. That evening, Maya visited with disturbing news from her investigation. "Someone's been tracking my research. My sources are getting warned off, and my editor received calls questioning my objectivity. Professional pressure to drop the story." "Blake?" Sarah said immediately. "Or someone working for him." "Sarah, I think there's a mole feeding him information about our plans." Sarah closed her eyes, the truth burning in her chest. "It's my mother." Maya's silence spoke volumes. "Are you certain?" I heard her on the phone. "She's reporting everything to Blake." Sarah's voice broke as she spoke the words aloud. "She paid Emma's medical bills to buy my trust, then sold us both out anyway." "What's her angle? Why help Blake? He probably bought her theater company or threatened to destroy it. Diane Cooper has never chosen family over business. I was stupid to think a granddaughter would change that." Maya sat beside Sarah in the NICU's family waiting area, both of them watching Emma sleep under the warming lights. The baby had gained almost a pound and was breathing on her own for longer periods. Progress that felt meaningless now that Sarah knew her own mother was working against them. "What do we do?" Maya asked. "We feed her false information," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "If Diane wants to play spy, let's give her something to report." The plan crystallized quickly. Sarah would pretend to trust Diane completely while carefully controlling what information she shared. Meanwhile, Maya would pursue her investigation through different channels, using sources Diane couldn't compromise. "There's something else," Maya said hesitantly. "I found evidence that Amber's pregnancy might be fake. Medical records suggest she had a hysterectomy 2 years ago after complications from cosmetic surgery." Sarah absorbed this information with grim satisfaction. "Blake doesn't know, unclear, but if Amber's been lying about being pregnant, it changes everything. Blake married her partially to create the perfect family image for the custody battle. Can you prove it?" "Working on it. But Sarah, if we expose Amber's deception, she might retaliate. These people play for keeps." As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Blake. "Court hearing next week to determine Emma's temporary custody. Diane says you're ready to be reasonable." Sarah showed the message to Maya, then typed her response, "I'll do whatever's best for Emma." It wasn't entirely a lie. Sarah would do whatever was best for Emma, but her definition of best no longer included trusting the people who'd claimed to love them. Later that night, as Sarah held Emma for the first time without machines monitoring every breath, she whispered promises her daughter couldn't understand, but would someday appreciate. "Your grandmother tried to protect you by keeping secrets. Your great-grandmother left us weapons for this war. And your mother is going to learn how to fight dirty, because apparently that's the only language these people understand." Emma's tiny fingers wrapped around Sarah's thumb, and for the first time since leaving Malibu, Sarah smiled with genuine hope. The Wesley Wellington empire was built on lies and betrayal, but Sarah Montgomery was about to become an expert in both. Sarah's performance for her mother would have earned standing ovations on Broadway. She played the broken, desperate daughter perfectly, feeding Diane carefully crafted lies while Maya worked her underground network of sources. "I'm thinking about accepting Blake's offer," Sarah told Diane over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. "Full custody to him, but I get visitation rights and a small trust fund for Emma's education." Diane's eyes lit up with what looked like maternal concern, but Sarah now recognized as business satisfaction. "That sounds very reasonable, darling. Blake just wants what's best for Emma." "I found something else in Grandmother's journal," Sarah continued, watching Diane's reaction carefully. "A safe deposit box number, but no location. I think she hid more evidence somewhere, but I'll never find it now." "Oh, sweetheart, don't worry about ancient history. Your future is what matters." Within hours, Sarah's phone rang. Blake himself, not his lawyers. "I understand you're ready to discuss terms," he said, his voice carrying the same calculated charm that had once made her feel special. I think we can reach an arrangement that works for everyone. I just want Emma to be safe and loved, Sarah said, injecting her voice with the exhaustion she truly felt. She will be. Amber and I can provide everything she needs. Stability, resources, a normal family life. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. Blake, who destroyed their marriage on live television, now promised stability. Amber, who might be faking her own pregnancy, offered normalcy. The hearing's in 3 days, Blake continued. Your mother says you understand why this is the best solution. After hanging up, Sarah found Maya in the hospital parking garage, both of them taking precautions against surveillance they now assumed was constant. I made contact with one of Amber's former assistants, Maya reported. Girl named Jessica, who was fired for asking too many questions. She's willing to talk, but she's scared. What did she see? Medical appointments that didn't match Amber's public pregnancy timeline. Prescription medications for someone who's supposedly carrying a baby. And this, Maya showed Sarah a photo on her phone. Amber's ultrasound photo from last month. Sarah studied the image, then checked the metadata Maya had isolated. This is from a stock photo website. She literally bought a fake ultrasound picture. Gets better. Jessica has recordings of Amber coaching her assistants on how to respond to pregnancy questions. Detailed scripts about morning sickness and cravings that Amber's never actually experienced. The evidence was damning, but Sarah understood the risks of exposing it. If we reveal this during the custody hearing, Amber will know we have an inside source. Jessica could face retaliation. Already considered that. Jessica's moving to Portland next week. New job, new life. Away from Amber's influence. She'll testify remotely if needed. Sarah nodded, then shared her own discovery. I've been studying grandmother's journal more carefully. There are references to something called Project Meridian that go beyond money laundering, environmental violations, worker safety issues, possibly deaths covered up, recent enough to matter legally. Some of it, Blake's still connected to companies that inherited liability from his father's operations. If we can prove ongoing cover-ups, it becomes a criminal matter. They were building a case piece by piece, but time was running short. The custody hearing would determine Emma's immediate future, and Sarah couldn't afford to lose while waiting for the perfect evidence. There's something else, Maya said hesitantly. My editor killed the story about Blake. Direct pressure from corporate sponsors who have business relationships with his companies. Sarah felt her last hope for legitimate media coverage disappear. So we're completely on our own. Not completely. I have a contact at a smaller publication. Someone who can't be bought or pressured. But Sarah, if we go public with this story, there's no going back. Blake will come after you with everything he has. He's already doing that. That evening, Sarah sat beside Emma's incubator, reading her grandmother's journal entries from the 1980s. Her grandmother had documented not just financial crimes, but human costs, workers exposed to toxic chemicals, families threatened into silence, a pattern of abuse that spanned decades. One entry stood out. Richard Wellington, today threatened my granddaughter's future if I ever reveal what I know. He doesn't understand that protecting her future is exactly why I document everything. Some wars are fought by the next generation. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Diane. Blake's lawyer wants to meet tomorrow to finalize custody arrangements. This is happening, darling. Time to accept reality. But Sarah was done accepting other people's versions of reality. Her grandmother had spent decades preparing weapons for this war. Maya had risked her career to gather ammunition, and Emma was growing stronger every day, as if she too understood that survival required fighting. Your great-grandmother was wrong about one thing, Sarah whispered to Emma. This war won't wait for the next generation. It's happening right now. Tomorrow, Sarah would sit across from Blake's lawyers and pretend to surrender. She'd sign papers that gave him temporary custody while she fought the real battle in shadows and courtrooms. But tonight, she was a general preparing for the most important campaign of her life. A war where victory meant not just keeping her daughter, but destroying the empire built on her family's silence. The mistress had laughed when the wife packed her bags. Soon, it would be Sarah's turn to laugh. The custody hearing took place in a courthouse where Blake's influence was as visible as the marble columns. Judge Harrison had officiated at charity events sponsored by Blake's companies. The court reporter wore jewelry from Amber's fashion line. Even the bailiff recognized Sarah as that crazy ex-wife from the internet. Sarah sat beside her court-appointed attorney, a overworked public defender who'd had 3 days to review a case Blake's team had been building for months. Across the aisle, Blake wore a perfectly tailored suit and an expression of patient suffering, playing the role of responsible father protecting his daughter from an unstable mother. Amber sat behind him, one hand resting protectively on her allegedly pregnant belly, wearing a demure dress that screamed innocence and maternal devotion. Her performance was flawless. If Sarah hadn't known about the fake ultrasounds and purchased medical records, she might have believed it herself. "Your Honor," Blake's lead attorney began, "this case represents a tragic situation where mental illness and vindictive behavior threaten an innocent child's welfare." The presentation was devastating in its thoroughness. They documented every stress-induced medical episode, framed as evidence of Sarah's instability. Her crowdfunding campaign became proof of financial irresponsibility. Her social media posts expressing frustration were labeled as harassment and stalking behavior. Mrs. Montgomery has demonstrated a pattern of erratic decision-making that culminated in her abandoning the family home and endangering her pregnancy through reckless behavior. The attorney continued. Mr. Wellington, meanwhile, has remarried and established a stable, loving environment perfect for raising children. Sarah's public defender objected weakly to the characterizations, but couldn't counter the mountain of evidence Blake's team had assembled. Financial records, medical reports, social media screenshots, witness statements from people Sarah had never met, but who swore she'd exhibited threatening behavior. Furthermore, Blake's attorney said, Mrs. Montgomery has been secretly investigating Mr. Wellington's business activities, suggesting she's more interested in revenge than her daughter's welfare. The words hit Sarah like ice water. They knew about her investigation, which meant Diane had reported more than Sarah had realized, or Blake had other sources monitoring her activities. Maya, sitting in the gallery, met Sarah's eyes with a look of grim determination. They'd discussed this possibility. If Blake knew about their investigation, it meant they were closer to something dangerous than they'd realized. Judge Harrison reviewed the evidence with the efficiency of someone who'd already made his decision. Based on the documentation presented, I'm ordering temporary custody of Emma Wellington to be granted to her father, Blake Wellington. Sarah's world shattered silently. She'd expected this outcome, planned for it, but hearing the words spoken aloud felt like watching Emma die. However, the judge continued, Mrs. Montgomery will be granted supervised visitation rights, pending completion of court-mandated psychological evaluation and parenting classes. The conditions were designed to humiliate her. Supervised visits meant state-appointed monitors documenting her every interaction with Emma. Psychological evaluation by doctors who'd be paid by the same system that favored Blake. Parenting classes that implied she was unfit to care for the daughter she'd carried and nearly died delivering. As the court session ended, Blake approached Sarah with an expression of false sympathy. This doesn't have to be permanent, he said quietly. Complete the requirements, prove you're stable, and we can discuss expanded visitation. What about when Amber's baby's born? Sarah asked, testing his reaction. Blake's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes. Our family will have room for love for both children. It was a perfect non-answer that confirmed Maya's suspicions. Blake either didn't know about Amber's deception, or he was complicit in it. Outside the courthouse, Diane waited with more flowers and sympathy. I'm so sorry, darling, but this isn't the end. You'll complete their requirements and prove you're a wonderful mother. Sarah nodded and played her role, accepting comfort from the woman who'd orchestrated her defeat. But inside, her resolve was crystallizing into something harder and sharper than grief. That evening, Maya brought news that changed everything. Jessica is ready to go public. She's got recordings, documentation, medical records that prove Amber's pregnancy is fake. What's the timeline? My contact at the independent publication wants to run the story tomorrow. It'll expose Amber's deception and raise questions about Blake's honesty in court proceedings. Sarah considered the implications. Exposing Amber's fake pregnancy might undermine Blake's credibility, but it would also trigger massive retaliation. Blake would assume Sarah was the source, regardless of protection for Jessica's identity. Do it, Sarah said, but we need to be ready for the counterattack. There's more. My investigation into Meridian Holdings uncovered something big. Blake's company is currently facing a federal investigation for environmental violations connected to his father's old operations. The FBI has been building a case for months. Sarah's pulse quickened. How long have they been investigating? At least 6 months, possibly longer. Sarah, this goes beyond civil court. We're talking about criminal charges that could send Blake to federal prison. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Blake's desperate rush to secure custody of Emma wasn't just about winning their personal war. It was about establishing himself as a stable family man before federal charges destroyed his public image. He knows, Sarah realized. Blake knows about the federal investigation. That's why he moved so fast to destroy my credibility and secure custody. He's trying to insulate himself before the arrests start. Maya nodded grimly. And if he goes down, he wants to take you with him. Discredit you completely so that even if he ends up in prison, you'll never get Emma back. Sarah stared out at the Los Angeles skyline, thinking about her grandmother's journal and the decades of evidence it contained. Her grandmother had documented crimes that spanned generations, building a case that was only now reaching its conclusion. Then we need to move faster than he does, Sarah said. Tomorrow, we destroy his perfect family image. Next week, we destroy his empire. The custody hearing had been Blake's victory, but it might also prove to be his fatal mistake. He'd taken Emma from Sarah in a court of law. Now she'd take everything from him in the court of public opinion. The war was entering its final phase. The article hit the internet at 5 a.m. Pacific time, just as the East Coast was drinking its morning coffee. Fake pregnancy scandal social media. Queen's elaborate deception exposed, spread across independent news sites like wildfire, complete with medical records, audio recordings, and photographic evidence that demolished Amber Sterling's carefully constructed image. Sarah watched the story explode from Emma's NICU room, where she was using her first supervised visitation to read to her daughter from a book of fairy tales. The court monitor, a tired-looking social worker named Mrs. Chen, seemed more interested in her own phone than documenting Sarah's maternal fitness. Once upon a time, Sarah read aloud, there was a princess who discovered that her kingdom was built on lies. She glanced at her phone, where notifications were arriving faster than she could read them. The hashtag #SureFakePregnancyScandal was trending worldwide. Maya texted constant updates. Amber's publicist just quit. Blake's stock prices dropping. Jessica's interview going viral. The recordings were particularly damaging. Jessica had captured hours of Amber coaching her assistants on pregnancy symptoms, discussing how to fake morning sickness for public appearances, and laughing about those idiotic followers who believe everything they see on social media. But the most devastating evidence was the medical records showing Amber's hysterectomy 2 years earlier, performed after complications from cosmetic surgery she'd hidden from Blake. The procedure made pregnancy impossible, turning her entire relationship with Blake into an elaborate con. By noon, Amber's Instagram account was flooded with comments from angry followers who felt betrayed. Her carefully curated content about pregnancy cravings and nursery planning now looked like cruel mockery. Brands started pulling sponsorship deals. Other influencers distanced themselves from the scandal. Blake's response was swift and predictable. He called an emergency press conference, standing behind a podium at his company headquarters with the kind of stern expression he usually reserved for congressional hearings. I am as shocked and devastated as anyone by these revelations about Amber, he said, his voice carrying just the right tone of betrayed husband. I believed her completely and feel deeply violated by her deception. The performance was masterful. Blake positioned himself as another victim of Amber's lies, a grieving husband whose trust had been exploited. He announced their separation effective immediately and expressed gratitude that the truth had emerged before their child was born. I will be pursuing legal action against Amber for fraud and emotional distress, Blake continued. But my primary focus remains on protecting my daughter Emma and ensuring she grows up in a stable, honest environment. Sarah had to admire his political instincts. Within hours, Blake had transformed from accomplice to victim, maintaining his custody of Emma while discarding Amber like a broken tool. But Maya's investigation had anticipated this move. Phase 2 launches in 30 minutes, she texted. Hope you're ready. The second wave of coverage focused on Blake's knowledge of Amber's deception. Financial records showed he'd paid for her medical procedures, including the hysterectomy. Credit card statements revealed purchases of fake pregnancy props and payments to medical technicians who'd created false documentation. Most damaging were the recordings Jessica had made of Blake himself, discussing how Amber's pregnancy would help his custody case against his unstable ex-wife. His voice, clear and unmistakable, strategizing about using a fabricated baby to destroy Sarah's maternal rights. The timeline doesn't work unless Blake knew from the beginning, Maya's anonymous source explained in a follow-up article. He married Amber specifically to create a fake family image for the custody battle. This wasn't spontaneous deception. This was calculated fraud. Sarah's phone rang as she was leaving the hospital. Diane's number. "Sarah, darling, we need to discuss damage control," her mother said, the warmth in her voice replaced by cold calculation. "Blake's lawyers are claiming you orchestrated this entire scandal to undermine his custody rights." "Did I?" Sarah asked innocently, though her heart was pounding with triumph. "Don't be clever with me. This could backfire spectacularly if Blake proves you leaked information to journalists. You could lose all visitation rights." Sarah almost laughed. Even now, Diane was working Blake's angle, trying to minimize the damage to her real employer. "I'm just focused on Emma's welfare." "Mother, isn't that what you said was most important? Blake wants to meet tonight, privately. He's willing to discuss modified custody arrangements if you call off your media dogs." "I'll consider it," Sarah lied, then hung up. The truth was, Sarah had no control over the avalanche she'd helped trigger. Maya's journalism network was operating independently now, following leads and sources that extended far beyond anything Sarah could influence. The story had taken on its own momentum, growing into something much larger than a custody dispute. By evening, federal investigators were publicly acknowledging their investigation into Blake's business practices. The environmental violations Maya had discovered were now front-page news, connected to a broader pattern of corporate criminality that implicated Blake in everything from tax evasion to witness intimidation. Sarah's grandmother's journal, it turned out, had documented not just historical crimes, but ongoing conspiracies that were still active. The FBI had been building their case using many of the same sources her grandmother had identified decades earlier. "Your grandmother was basically a federal informant," Maya explained during their evening call. "She documented everything and kept it safe until someone could use it properly. She was protecting future generations by building the weapons they'd need." As Sarah prepared for bed in her small apartment, she looked at photos of Emma on her phone. Her daughter was growing stronger every day, breathing on her own now and gaining weight steadily. Soon, Emma would be healthy enough to leave the NICU. By then, Sarah intended to have destroyed the empire that threatened their future. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, fresh scandals, and deeper investigations into the Wellington family's criminal legacy. Blake's perfect world was collapsing piece by piece, exactly as Sarah's grandmother had intended. The mistress had laughed when the wife packed her bags. But the wife had been planning her revenge for generations. The FBI raid on Blake's headquarters happened at dawn, captured live by news helicopters that had been monitoring his company since the fake pregnancy scandal broke. Sarah watched from her kitchen, coffee growing cold in her hands, as federal agents carried boxes of evidence from the building where she'd once attended Christmas parties and charity galas. Blake's social media empire, built on carefully crafted algorithms and influence networks, became his worst enemy as videos of the raid went viral within minutes. The hashtag #NosSharmWellington raid dominated trending topics worldwide, with millions of users dissecting every detail of the federal investigation. Maya called with updates as the story developed. "They've arrested 3 of his top executives and seized servers from all his companies. My sources say the charges include RICO violations, environmental crimes, and conspiracy to commit murder." The murder. Sarah's blood went cold. Related to cover-ups from his father's operations in the 80s, your grandmother documented workplace deaths that were reported as accidents. Turns out some of the victims were planning to testify about safety violations. Sarah's grandmother's journal suddenly felt heavier in her hands. Her meticulous records hadn't just documented financial crimes. They'd preserved evidence of real murders, families destroyed to protect Wellington profits. "Blake's not arrested yet," Maya continued, "but his passport's been flagged and his assets are frozen pending investigation. He's trapped." The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Blake had spent months positioning himself as the stable parent, the responsible father worthy of custody. Now he was the target of a federal criminal investigation that painted him as part of a generational crime syndicate. Sarah's phone rang. Diane again. But this time her voice carried desperation instead of calculated control. Sarah, you need to distance yourself from this immediately. Blake's lawyers are claiming you've been working with federal investigators to frame him. Have I? Sarah asked mildly, enjoying her mother's panic. This isn't a game. If Blake goes down, he'll take everyone with him. Your association with this investigation could what? Mother proved that I was trying to protect my daughter from a criminal. How terrible for my custody case. The irony was delicious. Blake's attempts to destroy Sarah's credibility had backfired spectacularly. Every unstable action he'd documented now looked like a mother's desperate attempt to protect her child from a dangerous father. Her stress-induced medical episodes became evidence of trauma caused by discovering her husband's criminal activities. By afternoon, Blake's entire narrative was collapsing. Emergency custody hearings were scheduled as Child Protective Services investigated whether Emma was safe in his care. The same judge who'd ruled against Sarah 48 hours earlier now faced federal pressure to reconsider his decision. Sarah arrived at the courthouse to find a media circus unlike anything she'd experienced. Reporters who'd previously portrayed her as a vengeful ex-wife now wanted her perspective as the whistleblower who'd exposed a criminal empire. Mrs. Montgomery, did you know about your husband's criminal activities during your marriage? One reporter shouted. I suspected something was wrong, Sarah said carefully. That's why I started investigating. A mother's instinct to protect her child. It was a perfect soundbite that reframed her entire story. Sarah wasn't the crazy ex-wife. She was the protective mother who'd risked everything to expose the truth about her daughter's father. Judge Harrison looked like he'd aged a decade since their previous hearing. The comfortable certainties of Blake's wealth and influence had evaporated, replaced by federal scrutiny that could end Harrison's career if he appeared compromised. Given the dramatic change in circumstances, the judge began, this court will reconsider the custody arrangement for Emma Wellington pending resolution of the federal criminal investigation. Blake's lawyer objected strenuously, arguing that unproven allegations shouldn't affect custody rights. But the prosecution presented evidence that Blake had used his daughter as leverage in business negotiations, mentioning her specifically in recorded conversations about intimidating potential witnesses. Mr. Wellington's own words suggest he views his child as a strategic asset rather than a person deserving protection, the prosecutor argued. Given the ongoing federal investigation and credible threats to witness safety, Emma Montgomery is potentially at risk in her father's custody. The decision was swift and decisive. Emma would be returned to Sarah's custody immediately, with Blake granted only supervised visitation pending resolution of the criminal charges. Sarah felt her knees weaken with relief as the judge spoke the words she'd dreamed of hearing. Her daughter was coming home, but the victory came with warnings. Blake's lawyer made veiled threats about appeals and continued investigations into Sarah's role in his client's downfall. The implication was clear. Blake might be trapped, but he wasn't defeated. Outside the courthouse, Maya waited with news that complicated the celebration. Amber's talking to federal investigators, she reported. She's claiming Blake threatened her into the fake pregnancy scheme. Says he told her about the federal investigation months ago and convinced her that playing the perfect stepmother was the only way to avoid prosecution. You think she's telling the truth? I think she's trying to save herself, but her testimony could be devastating for Blake. She's got recordings of conversations where he explicitly discusses using Emma to manipulate the courts and intimidate witnesses. That evening, Sarah sat in Emma's newly prepared nursery, assembling the crib she'd bought months earlier, but never had the chance to use. Tomorrow, Emma would come home from the hospital. Her daughter would finally be safe, surrounded by love instead of lies. But Sarah understood that Blake's war wasn't over. Federal investigations moved slowly, and wealthy criminals had resources to fight charges for years. Even if Blake eventually went to prison, his influence network remained intact. Her grandmother's journal lay open on the changing table, revealing page after page of carefully documented evidence that had taken decades to matter. The final entry, written shortly before her grandmother's death, contained a message that now felt prophetic. The Wellington family believes their power makes them untouchable. They're wrong. Truth has its own power, and justice has its own timeline. Someday, someone will use these weapons I've prepared. I pray they'll be strong enough to finish what I started. Sarah touched Emma's ultrasound photo, taped to the inside cover of the journal. We finished it, Grandma. We won. But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew the real work was just beginning. Destroying Blake's empire was only the first step. Rebuilding their lives would require different kinds of courage. Emma came home on a Tuesday morning in October, weighing 5 pounds and breathing entirely on her own. Sarah carried her daughter through the door of their new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in a neighborhood where no one recognized them from tabloid headlines or social media scandals. The space was small but filled with everything Emma needed: a crib by the window, where morning light would wake her gently, a rocking chair where Sarah could nurse her while reading from her grandmother's journal, and walls covered with photos documenting every day of Emma's young life. Maya visited that afternoon, bringing groceries and news from the outside world. Blake's trial had been scheduled for the following spring, with charges that could result in life imprisonment. Amber was cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for immunity, providing testimony that painted Blake as the architect of elaborate schemes spanning decades. "She's beautiful," Maya said, watching Emma sleep in Sarah's arms. Hard to believe all this chaos was supposed to be about her welfare. "Blake never cared about Emma," Sarah said quietly. "She was just another asset to control, another way to protect himself from consequences." The custody arrangement had been finalized without Blake's input. He'd been denied bail after prosecutors argued he was a flight risk with resources to disappear internationally. Supervised visitation rights were suspended entirely after recording surfaced of Blake instructing associates to gather leverage against Sarah and the journalist friend who'd exposed him. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her publisher. "First draft looking amazing. Film rights interest already coming in." The book had started as therapy, a way to process the trauma of losing and reclaiming her daughter. But as Sarah wrote about her grandmother's courage and her own fight for justice, the story had evolved into something larger, a testament to the power of truth and the long arc of justice that her grandmother had understood so clearly. "Any regrets?" Maya asked, settling into the rocking chair while Sarah prepared Emma's bottle. Sarah considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she'd been married to a billionaire, living in a mansion, believing her biggest problem was Blake's lack of attention to her music career. Now she was a single mother in a small apartment, supporting herself with book advances and occasional freelance songwriting. "No," she said finally. "Everything I lost was built on lies anyway. This is real." Emma stirred in her arms, tiny fingers grasping at air before settling against Sarah's chest. The NICU doctors had predicted possible developmental delays, ongoing health issues, and years of medical monitoring. Instead, Emma was thriving, meeting every milestone with the determination Sarah recognized from her own family line. "What about your mother?" Maya asked. Sarah's relationship with Diane remained complicated. Her mother had testified for the prosecution, revealing Blake's attempts to buy her cooperation and providing evidence of his witness intimidation tactics. But trust, once broken, couldn't be easily repaired. "She's trying," Sarah said diplomatically. "Sent flowers when Emma came home, offered to help with childcare. But she chose Blake's money over our family once. I can't forget that." Maya nodded, understanding the complexity of family relationships damaged by betrayal. "And Blake, any word from his cell? His lawyers keep filing appeals, but they're all getting denied. The evidence is overwhelming." Sarah looked down at Emma, who was falling asleep again after finishing her bottle. "He'll probably die in prison. Part of me feels sorry for him. Only part of you. The part that remembers why I loved him once, before I understood what he really was." Sarah carried Emma to her crib, tucking her daughter under blankets hand-knitted by women at a local church who'd read about their story and wanted to help. "But mostly I'm grateful Emma will never know that version of her father." The apartment was quiet except for Emma's soft breathing and the distant sounds of traffic. Sarah had grown to love this ordinary peace after months of chaos and publicity. No photographers hiding in bushes, no legal papers served by surprise, no betrayals disguised as family support. Maya gathered her things to leave, but paused at the door. "The film rights meeting is next week. Thursday, 3 different studios want to option the story. Sarah smiled at the irony. Amber was right about one thing. I did write a book about my boring little life. Turns out people find it interesting. What about the movie title? Sarah had been thinking about that. The original working title focused on Blake's betrayal and downfall. But the real story was about something else entirely. About generational courage and the patient work of justice. About a grandmother who'd documented crimes for decades and a mother who'd finished the work when the time was right. The long game, Sarah said, because that's what this really was. Grandma played the long game, gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment. I just happened to be the right person at the right time to finish what she started. That evening, after Maya left, Sarah sat in the rocking chair with Emma sleeping in her arms and her grandmother's journal open on the side table. The final pages contained letters addressed to Sarah specifically, written years before Emma was born, but somehow anticipating everything that would happen. My dear granddaughter, one letter began. If you're reading this, it means the Wellington family has finally shown their true nature. I hope I've given you the weapons you need to protect yourself and your children. Remember that power built on lies is always temporary. Truth has its own power, and justice has its own timeline. Sarah closed the journal and looked around their small apartment, measuring their current reality against the mansion she'd left behind. Less space, but more safety. Fewer luxuries, but more love. A smaller life, but a truthful one. Emma stirred in her sleep, and Sarah began humming a lullaby she'd written during those dark days in the hospital. The melody was simple, but the lyrics told a story about brave women who fought for their children and grandmothers who left secret gifts for future generations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, book deadlines and movie negotiations and the ongoing work of raising a daughter as a single mother. But tonight, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Malibu: complete peace. The war was over. Truth had won. And Emma would grow up knowing that her mother had fought for her, just as her great-grandmother had fought for them all. The Netflix offices in Hollywood were exactly what Sarah had expected: glass walls, modern furniture, and executives who looked young enough to be her college interns. But they'd offered the highest bid for her story, and more importantly, they'd promised her creative control over the adaptation. The market research is incredible, the development executive explained, sliding a folder across the conference table. Your story hits every demographic we're targeting: betrayal, social media drama, legal thriller, mother-daughter relationships, and a satisfying justice ending. Sarah reviewed the contract terms while Emma slept in her carrier beside the table. 2 months after coming home from the hospital, Emma had become an expert traveler, sleeping peacefully through meetings that would determine how their story was told to the world. $10 million for the rights, Sarah said, still amazed by the number. That's life-changing money. It's franchise money, the executive corrected. We're thinking limited series for the main story, with potential spin-offs exploring your grandmother's backstory and maybe a documentary about the federal investigation. Maya, who joined the meeting as Sarah's representative, took notes on every detail. Her own journalism career had exploded since exposing Blake's crimes, with book deals and speaking engagements that had made her a nationally recognized expert on corruption and digital influence. What about casting? Sarah asked. I want input on who plays me. Absolutely. We're thinking established actresses who can handle both the emotional trauma and the courtroom drama. Names like Amy Adams, Reese Witherspoon, maybe Kerry Washington. Sarah tried to imagine famous actresses portraying the lowest moments of her life. The hospital scenes where she'd nearly lost Emma. The motel room where she'd planned her counterattack. The courthouse where she'd won custody of her daughter. And Blake. That's trickier. We need someone who can make the audience understand why you fell for him initially, then hate him by the end. Maybe Oscar Isaac or Michael Shannon. The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from filming locations to soundtrack options. Sarah found herself thinking about how her grandmother would have reacted to this moment. The quiet bookkeeper who documented crimes in secret, never imagining her evidence would become the basis for a Hollywood blockbuster. After signing the contracts, Sarah and Maya celebrated with lunch at a restaurant overlooking the Pacific. Emma was awake now, alert and curious about the world around her, tracking voices with the focused attention that reminded Sarah of herself when she was writing songs. Any second thoughts? Maya asked, cutting into her salad. About the movie deal, Blake destroyed my privacy anyway. At least this way, I control the narrative. Sarah adjusted Emma's blanket, protecting her from the ocean breeze. Plus, the money means Emma's college is paid for, and I can focus on writing without worrying about bills. I meant about everything. The whole war against Blake. Sometimes I wonder if we could have found a different way. Sarah considered the question while watching waves crash against the distant shore. Could she have negotiated a quiet divorce, accepted a smaller custody arrangement, found a way to protect Emma without destroying Blake's empire? Look at what we uncovered, Sarah said finally. Environmental crimes that were still happening, workers who were still being threatened, witnesses who were still being intimidated. Blake wasn't just dangerous to me and Emma. He was dangerous to everyone. The federal investigation would have happened eventually. Maybe. But how many more people would have been hurt while investigators built their case? How many more families would have suffered while Blake consolidated his power? Sarah touched Emma's cheek, watching her daughter's eyes track the movement. I didn't choose this war. Blake did. When he decided to use our daughter as a weapon, I just finished what my grandmother started. Maya nodded, understanding the moral complexity of their situation. They destroyed a powerful man in his criminal empire, but the collateral damage had been significant. Amber's career was ruined. Despite her cooperation with prosecutors, Diane's theater company had folded after the scandal. Dozens of employees at Blake's companies had lost their jobs when the federal seizure shut down operations. Do you think Emma will understand when she's older? Maya asked. Sarah looked down at her daughter, who was now reaching for the sunlight filtering through the restaurant's windows. Emma would grow up knowing her father was in federal prison, that her early life had been shaped by battles fought in courtrooms and newsrooms. But she'd also know that her mother had fought for her, that her great-grandmother had prepared weapons for this war, that their family had a tradition of standing up to powerful people who thought themselves untouchable. She'll understand that sometimes protecting the people you love requires making difficult choices, Sarah said. And that truth has its own power, even when it takes generations to matter. The Netflix executive called that evening with updates on the production timeline. Filming would begin in the spring, with a release date planned to coincide with Blake's trial verdict. The marketing team was already developing campaigns around themes of justice, family, and the power of ordinary people to expose corruption. Your story is resonating internationally, the executive explained. We're getting interest from distributors in 20 countries. This could be our biggest limited series launch this year. After hanging up, Sarah sat in Emma's nursery, reading aloud from her grandmother's journal, while her daughter listened with the serious attention babies give to their mother's voice. The entries from the 1980s seemed like ancient history now, but they'd provided the foundation for everything that followed. Your great-grandmother was very smart, Sarah told Emma. She understood that some fights are bigger than one person, that some victories take longer than one lifetime. She prepared weapons and waited for the right moment to use them. Emma reached for the journal's leather binding, tiny fingers exploring the worn cover that had protected family secrets for decades. Sarah guided her daughter's hand across the pages, connecting her to the heritage of women who'd refused to accept injustice quietly. And your mother learned that sometimes the people who hurt you the most end up giving you the greatest gifts, Sarah continued. Blake thought he was destroying our family. Instead, he gave us a chance to discover how strong we really are. The apartment was quiet except for Emma's contented sounds and the distant hum of traffic. In 6 months, cameras would film reenactments of their story in these same rooms. Actresses would portray Sarah's lowest moments and greatest triumphs. The world would judge whether she'd been justified in her war against Blake's empire. But tonight, none of that mattered. Emma was healthy and safe. Blake was in federal custody awaiting trial. The truth had been told, and justice was being served. Sarah closed her grandmother's journal and carried Emma to the window, where city lights sparkled like stars against the darkness. Somewhere in those lights were other families fighting their own battles against powerful people who thought themselves untouchable. Other women gathering evidence and preparing for wars that might not be fought for years. The mistress laughed when the wife packed her bags, Sarah whispered to Emma. But the wife had the last laugh after all. Emma smiled in response, and Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The long game was over, but their story was just beginning.